He knew the sound of her ventilator better than his own heartbeat. He had learned the language of eyelids that never moved and fingers that never curled. He promised himself he would never fall in love with a silence, and then the silence learned his name. By the time winter found its way down the hospital's glass spine, Dr. Noah Ellison had memorized everything about room 407. He could tell what hour it was from the angle of the light crawling across the linoleum, could trace the shape of the city in the reflection of the window, could anticipate the shift change size like tides. The room held Elena Moreau the way a museum keeps a paint-and-controlled air, careful distance, signs reminding everyone not to touch, yet he felt her presence in the places they never caution you about, the places medicine doesn't chart. She had arrived after a collision with a steel guardrail and the kind of luck that breaks like glass. He arrived years earlier after a fellowship that taught him to cut millimeters from disaster without flinching. In the weeks that followed, his voice became the one constant in her midnight storms. Updates spoken to a quiet that never answered, stories offered like bread to a locked door. A rhythm that kept him from listening to his own loneliness. He told her about the city's first snow and the way it buried sirens in cotton, about the resident who fainted during rounds and tried to pretend he had dropped a pen, about the old pianist who played Chopin on a tablet between chemo drips and swore the notes tasted like rain. He told her the facts of her skin and the fictions of the world outside it, and somewhere between the facts and the fictions his guard slipped. Love did not crash through him, it pooled, a quiet flood, a devotion he hid in the folds of protocol and the sterile creases of his coat. He never admitted it out loud, not to the ethics committee in his head, not to the attending whose gray eyes missed nothing, not even to the chaplain who seemed to catch confessions the way others caught colds. Love, in his world, was a variable that contaminated data. Love, in his world, risked turning scalpel edges into hands that shook. Still he found himself searching the quiet for traces no monitor could capture, the way her jaw softened when the night nurse spoke of moonlight, the almost imperceptible drop in heart rate when he read from the book found in her car, the pages marked with the stunned elegance of a woman who had been learning to forgive herself for something he could not name. He learned her medical history like scripture and her human history like a scavenger, a sister who sent orchids and apologies, a father who never came, a sketchbook in her bag with a red thread tucked into the spine. The surgeons mapped the lesion as if it were a city to be liberated. Noah traced it the way a cartographer touches a border he cannot cross. The decision to operate arrived like thunder on a clear day. 2 months of plateau had hardened into the kind of standstill that tempts despair, then an EEG tremor hinted at a door inside the dark. The tumor's edges, if you were generous enough to call them edges, had shifted a few cruel millimeters, inviting action today that might be impossible tomorrow. The board debated and nodded. The consent lived in the hands of a sister signing on behalf of a future none of them could guarantee. The risks were recited in a language that sounded like mathematics and grief. Noah prepped for the surgery with the steady choreography of a man pretending not to hear the drum inside his ribs. He rehearsed the route past eloquent cortex, past the neighborhoods where speech and memory pay rent, past the alley where sensation hides from knives. He rehearsed the moment he would step back and reclaim the neutrality his badge demanded. He told himself love would wait outside the OR like a visitor after hours. Night folded into morning with the subtlety of an anesthesiologist's whisper. The OR lights poured down like daylight turned to law. The team assembled, Sanchez with her calm hands, Yuki with the eyes that smiled only when the clamps clicked, Porter at anesthesia with the patience of old trees, and Noah with a quiet that steadied the room. Elena lay under the blue of a sky that had draped across her body, her face framed by tape and intention, her hair braided to keep it from the wound they would open like a door into a house whose owner had stopped answering. He stood at her side in the ritual seconds before they began and let the silence say everything he could not. The monitor spoke in green syllables, her chest rose and fell like a tide that did not belong to her. He felt the small rebellious tenderness of wanting to apologize before you break someone to save them. They began with the precision of people who had practiced being gods and finally learned to be careful. Skin, fascia, bone, each layer surrendered in a language of increments. The navigational system pulsed with coordinates like constellations, telling them where not to sink the night. He made the incision as if it were a promise and followed the path as if it were a prayer, guiding himself around the bright provinces of speech and the shadow country of memory. Time stopped measuring itself in minutes and shifted to millimeters. He forgot that he had upbraided a resident earlier for confusing proximal and distal, forgot the winter, forgot the orchids. He knew only the thin threshold between rescue and ruin, the way a suction sigh can sound like relief, the way an artery's pulse can sound like a warning clearing its throat. Then, in a flicker that first registered as an error, the waveform jittered. Porter's head tilted a degree. Sanchez paused with the gentle gravity of someone who has seen storms turn mid-flight. The field was stable, blood loss minimal, ICP poised like a tightrope walker who had decided to behave. Yet the monitor stuttered, the kind of noise you chalk up to a sensor that needs convincing until it did not look like noise at all. Noah breathed and held and breathed again, and the room followed the rhythm like a choir that had lost its hymn sheet and remembered the melody anyway. The burr hole edges were clean, the Dura had closed its complaint. He leaned in, and that was when it happened. Her eyelids, under the surgical drape's careful window, trembled. It was not the impersonal twitch anesthesia grants like ums. It was the deliberate shiver of a mind sending a postcard. The lid rose a fraction, then another, until the iris green like river glass found the light. She didn't flinch, she looked, and the look, impossibly, landed on him. Somewhere, a retractor hummed in a metal register. Somewhere, the ventilation counted its quiet decades. In the moving ocean of lines and numbers, Helena made a choice that none of the machines could own. She opened her eyes in the center of the storm and met the man who had been speaking to her across the abyss. The room obeyed training because training is what you obey when astonishment roars. Porter adjusted the inhalational agent, hands steady. Sanchez murmured a calm that anchored the interns to the floor. Yuki tightened the field as if tightening a sentence. Noah did not move. He felt the war inside him, the surgeon who must ignore miracles and the man who had asked a silence to forgive him if he failed. He thought of the code that defended patients from the chaos of physicians' hearts, the long lectures about transference and projection, the articles that read like roadblocks and were meant to save lives. He thought of the nights in room 407 when he had read to her about river deltas and red threads, when he had promised the air he would keep his distance and then measured it with a ruler. Elena's gaze did not dart or plead, it rested. It seemed almost curious, as if she had awakened not to pain but to a question. He heard a sound and realized it was his name, not spoken but remembered, the way a shoreline recognizes the tide. The last time he had felt this exact, suspended terror was in a different OR years ago, when he had chased a bleed into a corner and found nothing but his own heartbeat to argue with. He lifted his eyes from the field and let them meet hers. The distance between doctor and patient was supposed to be a bridge he would never walk across. She crossed it with a look. Protocol won the first round. He nodded to Porter, recalibrated, let pharmacology reassert its kingdom. Her eyelids sank obediently, the river glass retreating behind a soft shore. The team released a collective breath no one would admit to taking. The monitor softened into its green lullaby. He forced his hands to remember what they had always known, where to spare, where to cut, how to retreat without leaving behind a wound the mind would find later and name disaster. Layer by layer, he reversed the opening. The suture held, the stapler whispered, the drape lifted. The lights, all at once, felt too bright for what had happened in their glare. Back in the scrub room, water ran over his fingers like the first honest thing to touch him all day. He stared at his hands and thought about thresholds and the names we give them to feel less afraid. He had loved a silence, now the silence had eyes. He could not pretend it would change nothing. He could only decide what kind of man he would be when it changed everything. In the days after the surgery, the hospital became a different kind of silence. Not the sterile, professional quiet he was trained to live within, but something heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Dr. Noah Ellison walked the corridors like a ghost in scrubs, trying to remember what normal used to feel like. He replayed every second of that moment in the operating room, convincing himself that it had been a reflex, a trick of the nerves, a physiological accident. But deep down, in the quiet recess of his thoughts, he knew what he had seen. He had seen awareness. He had seen her. Elena was transferred back to room 407 the next morning. The reports listed postoperative stability, spontaneous eye movement, and possible transient awakening. They read like data points, neat, contained, safe, but Noah read them like a confession. He stood by her bedside again, the familiar rhythm of machines tracing the shape of her existence, and he whispered words that made no medical sense. "You're coming back, aren't you?" The sentence hung in the air, suspended between devotion and disbelief. Nurses passed by without noticing the quiet gravity that clung to him. To them, she was just another recovery case. To him, she was a miracle he was forbidden to name. He tried to bury himself in rounds, in paperwork, in the endless choreography of medicine that left no room for hearts to misbehave. But every corridor led back to her door. Every sound of the ventilator reminded him of that moment, those eyes finding him through the storm. One evening, long after visiting hours had ended, he returned to her room again. The hospital was dark except for the dull orange glow of the city leaking through the blinds. The world outside was sleeping. Inside, she existed in the delicate balance between two worlds. He sat down beside her, the same way he had hundreds of times before, only now his silence felt different. It wasn't the stillness of waiting, it was the stillness of recognition. He spoke softly, as if she might still be listening beneath the waves of sedation. He told her about the surgery, about how her heart had steadied when it should have raced, about how her eyelids had moved in defiance of everything science knew. He confessed the part he could never tell anyone, that when she opened her eyes, he felt as if something in him had been seen for the first time too. "You don't know me," he whispered, "but I've been here. Every night." Her fingers twitched, a motion so faint it could have been a trick of light. His breath caught. The monitors remained calm, indifferent. But his heart didn't. He leaned closer, his face just inches from hers, watching for any trace of intention behind the movement. Nothing followed, yet something had changed. The air between them felt charged, alive, like a wire carrying electricity from a place he could not name. The next morning, during rounds, his attending, Dr. Harper, caught the distance in his gaze. "You look distracted, Allison," she said without looking up from the chart. "Get some rest. Don't let your patients follow you home." He smiled faintly, hiding behind professionalism, and answered, "I never do," but it was a lie, because she followed him everywhere now. In his dreams, in the echo of the machines, in the way he avoided the mirror, afraid he'd see her eyes instead of his own. Days turned into weeks. The surgical scar healed perfectly. Her vitals were steady, reflexes inconsistent. But sometimes, when he entered the room, the monitors shifted by a beat. A heart rate rising by 2 points, a breath slightly deeper, as if she recognized the sound of his steps. He tried not to notice. He failed every time. He started to read to her again, not the case notes or the hospital policies, but the poetry she once loved. The sister had mentioned it offhandedly, during a conversation he wasn't supposed to remember. She used to read Neruda before bed. Said it made the world quieter, so he read. His voice was soft, almost reverent, as he spoke the lines about love surviving in silence, about the way hearts remember even when the mind forgets. And as the last line slipped from his lips, he thought he saw it, the smallest tear forming at the corner of her eye, catching the hospital light like glass. He blinked, unsure if it was real, but he didn't wipe it away. He just sat there, in the hush of the machines, his heart beating louder than the monitors, and whispered a single promise that no medical chart would ever record. "If you wake up, I'll be here." The tear haunted him. It was the kind of thing that defied medicine, a single, fragile drop that carried more weight than every report he had written that week. Noah told himself it was a reflex, the body's strange mimicry of emotion, but something in him refused that explanation. He had seen enough death to know when life was reaching out, even from the depths of silence. He didn't tell anyone. Not Harper, not the nurses, not the neuro team who came by with their clipboards and detachment. It was his secret, and keeping it felt like protecting something sacred. Every evening after his rounds, he lingered in room 407, long after the hallway lights dimmed to their night mode. He sat in the same chair, reading under the dull hum of fluorescent lights, sometimes speaking to her, sometimes simply listening to the rhythm of her machines. The room had begun to feel less like a patient's space and more like a confession booth, one where only one side ever spoke, but both souls were heard. He started noticing the small things, the faint flutter of her eyelids when he entered, the subtle rise in her heart rate when he spoke. It could have been coincidence, 100 times, but each time it happened, it became harder to believe it was. There was a rhythm between them now, quiet but undeniable, like two instruments tuning to the same frequency. One night, he arrived later than usual. The storm outside painted streaks of silver across the hospital windows. The power flickered once, twice, before settling into a fragile calm. In that half-dark, half-light room, he pulled the chair closer to her bed and spoke the truth he had buried beneath professionalism. "I know I'm not supposed to feel this," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Doctors aren't supposed to fall in love with ghosts," the ventilator hissed in steady reply. He leaned closer. "But you're not a ghost, are you?" He looked at her face, peaceful, untouched by the chaos that surrounded her. And in that quiet, he saw something that both comforted and destroyed him. She wasn't gone. She was somewhere, caught between worlds, listening, waiting. The thought brought him both hope and unbearable sorrow. Because love, when it cannot be returned, becomes both prayer and punishment. Over the next few days, his presence became part of her care plan, unofficially. The nurses no longer questioned why he stayed late. They assumed it was guilt or dedication. Some whispered that he was obsessed with saving her because he couldn't save someone else before. Maybe they were right, but they didn't see the way he spoke to her like she could hear him. They didn't feel the way the air changed when he entered. One morning, while checking her reflexes, he noticed something new, the faintest curl of her fingers when his hand brushed hers. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through him. He pressed the call button, trying to sound calm. "Get neurology," he said, but his voice betrayed him. When the team arrived, the reflex was gone. The attending tapped her hand again, waiting for a movement that didn't return. They noted transient response and left, unconvinced. But Noah stood there longer, his hand still hovering above hers, whispering, "I know you felt that." Later that evening, he reviewed her EEG himself, scrolling through the digital traces that mapped her silence in lines of electricity. In one section, only a few seconds long, he found it. A spike, a wave that shouldn't have been there. Activity, faint but real. He stared at it until the screen blurred. She was waking up. The realization terrified him, because love for a sleeping woman was safe in theory, no choices, no consequences, no rejection. But if she woke, if she truly came back, he would have to face the truth of what he had become, the doctor who crossed a line. The man who fell in love with a patient who had never spoken a single word to him. He turned off the monitor, shut down the screen, and sat in the dark lab, the hum of machines echoing like a heartbeat. Somewhere above, rain began to tap against the glass ceiling. He imagined her lying there, eyes closed, caught in that twilight between coma and consciousness. And for the first time, he whispered her name, not as a physician, but as a man surrendering to something he could no longer deny. "Elena." The silence answered with a soft, rhythmic beep, one beat faster than before. The morning after the rain, the world felt softer, as if the hospital itself had been washed clean of its usual fatigue. Noah walked through the hallways with a calm that wasn't calm at all. It was the trembling quiet that comes before revelation. He went straight to room 407, heartbeat drumming against the steady rhythm of the machines. The light spilling through the blinds cut across Elena's face in gentle gold lines, giving her the illusion of being half awake already. He stood there for a long time, not as her doctor but as someone afraid to believe in miracles. The charts said minimally conscious state, the nurses said stable, and his colleagues said don't get attached. But attachment had already rooted itself deep within him, invisible, unstoppable, like ivy climbing through the cracks of logic. He adjusted her blanket, a habitual gesture, then noticed something small yet staggering. Her breathing shifted when he touched her hand, subtle but real. He sat beside her again, leaning close enough to hear the faint sound of her exhale. "Elena," he said softly, like a word he wasn't sure he had permission to speak. "You're still fighting, aren't you?" The air between them thickened, charged with the weight of everything he couldn't confess aloud. He wanted to tell her how lonely the hospital felt without her silence. How, somehow, her stillness had become the only place he could breathe. Over the next days, her responses began to multiply, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make science nervous. She reacted to his voice, not to anyone else's. Her EEG spiked when he entered the room, flattening when he left. When he read to her, her pulse synchronized with his speech pattern, like her body remembered a rhythm it had learned before the world fell apart. He started documenting everything in a secret notebook, the kind that never made its way to the hospital's electronic files, a place where medicine met faith. Day 47, eyelid flicker, possibly intentional. Whispered her name, heart rate increased. He couldn't explain why he was doing it. Maybe it was guilt, maybe devotion, maybe both. One evening, as the sun began to drown behind the hospital's glass facade, he sat by her bed reading from her sketchbook. It had been returned by her sister, full of charcoal drawings, rough and intimate. Faces, trees, empty rooms, and words written along the margins. Light always remembers where to return. He traced the line with his finger, whispering it under his breath, and that's when it happened again. Her fingers moved, this time unmistakably, slowly, weakly, curling toward the sound of his voice. He froze. The book slipped from his lap. The monitors began to sing in soft urgency. Elena, his voice cracked. Her fingers twitched again, a half-second of fragile rebellion against the coma that had claimed her. He pressed the call button, but part of him wanted to be alone in this miracle. The nurses rushed in, the neurologist was paged, but by the time they arrived, the movement was gone. The team examined her, noted possible spontaneous muscle reaction, and left with professional indifference. To them, it was data. To him, it was destiny stirring in the dark. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed in the room, watching her, afraid that if he blinked she would slip back into the unreachable. The world outside turned silent. The hospital slowed into its after-midnight hum. He sat there, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of his mouth, a man torn between science and faith. At 2:17 a.m., the ventilator released a soft sigh, and her lips parted. Just slightly, enough to let a faint sound escape, something between breath and whisper. He leaned forward, his pulse racing. Her mouth formed one broken syllable. It was his name. The sound was faint, uncertain, like an echo from a distant dream. But it was there. His throat tightened, tears welling before reason could stop them. "I'm here," he whispered, voice shaking. "I'm right here." She didn't move again, but her monitor did, a single flutter in the steady green light, like a heart remembering how to find its way home. He sat back, hands trembling, and understood what it meant. The woman he loved wasn't just waking up, she was returning to him. And if she did, nothing in his world would ever be the same again. By the time morning spilled through the blinds again, Noah was still there, shoulders slumped, eyes red, a man who hadn't slept but couldn't dream of leaving. Every hour through the night, he had checked her vitals, whispered her name, watched her eyelids twitch as if she were trying to reach him through the distance of her own mind. He knew the nurses would start asking questions soon. His shift had ended 12 hours ago, but time had lost its authority the moment she said his name. Dr. Harper found him there at dawn, the room painted in the gray-blue of early light. She stepped inside quietly, her voice carrying that precise mix of concern and warning that senior doctors perfected. "Ellison," she said softly, "you can't do this. You're too close." He didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the faint rise and fall of Elena's chest. "I heard what happened last night," she continued, crossing her arms. "The nurse said she might have whispered something, but you know how unreliable coma responses are. You need to step back before you lose objectivity." He looked at her then, not as a subordinate, but as a man clinging to something he couldn't explain. "She said my name," he murmured. "That's not coincidence." Harper sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years of seeing brilliance dissolve into obsession. "I know what you think you heard. I've been there. The line between hope and delusion is thinner than you imagine." He swallowed hard, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then let me be delusional for one more night." She didn't argue. She just nodded once and left the room, letting the door close with the soft click of reluctant mercy. For the next 3 days, the world narrowed to room 407. Noah worked his scheduled hours, then returned to her bedside, recording every small movement, every anomaly in her vitals, every heartbeat that dared to break rhythm when he spoke. Sleep became an afterthought, food irrelevant. He existed between the sound of her breathing and the silence of her stillness. And then, on the 4th night, something changed. It was just past midnight. The hospital lights dimmed to their night hue, the machines whispering their endless code. Noah sat beside her, reading aloud from the same Neruda book, his voice tired but tender. Halfway through a line about love that lives even in absence, her fingers moved again, this time stronger, more deliberate. He froze, the book slipping slightly in his grip. Her lips parted once more, and a quiet, broken word escaped. Where am I? Every cell in his body went still. He rose halfway from the chair, the impossible moment stretching across the room like the first breath after drowning. Elena, he whispered, you're safe. You're at St. Augustine Medical. You. Her head shifted slightly toward the sound, the weak flutter of her eyelashes opening against the light. Her gaze was unfocused, fragile, but real. She blinked once, twice, and then her eyes, those same green eyes that had found him in the operating room, met his. The world collapsed into silence. Tears welled in his eyes, but he swallowed them, his instinct as a physician warring with the ache in his chest. He pressed the intercom with trembling fingers. Code Neuro Recovery, room 407, he said, voice trembling. But even as he said it, his eyes never left hers. She tried to speak again, her lips forming shapes without sound. He leaned closer, catching the whisper as if it were the most fragile thing in existence. You, she breathed, you were there. The words hit him like a pulse. His breath caught, memory crashing back to the surgery, the moment her eyes had opened mid-procedure. She remembered. Somehow, impossibly, she remembered. When the team rushed in, he stepped back, forcing himself into composure. Nurses, neurologists, the hum of instruments, they filled the room with the chaos of science. Harper pushed through the door, eyes wide with disbelief. She's conscious. Noah just nodded, his hands shaking. Elena's eyes flickered between the faces, confusion tracing her features. But when they dimmed the lights and began their tests, her gaze kept returning, again and again, to him. As if, in the noise of the world reawakening, he was the one sound she still recognized. Later that night, when the room finally emptied and the hum settled into quiet again, he sat beside her once more. She was awake but exhausted, her voice a ghost of sound. He reached out, careful not to cross the fragile boundary between care and confession. You've been asleep a long time, he said softly. Her eyes glistened in the half-light. No, she murmured, weakly. I was listening. And for the first time, he realized, she hadn't just heard him. She had felt him, through every hour, every story, every word spoken into the dark. He looked down, unable to speak. The man who had loved a silence now sat before the voice that silence had been keeping. In the days that followed, the hospital became a theater of disbelief. Nurses whispered in hallways, doctors compared scans like miracles printed on film. Elena Moreau, the woman who had been trapped in silence for nearly 4 months, had opened her eyes and spoken. No one could explain it. The brain injury was supposed to have taken more than words. It was supposed to have taken time itself. And yet, here she was, slowly returning to the world as if it had been waiting for her. Noah stayed close, though officially he was no longer assigned to her case. Harper had transferred her recovery plan to another physician, citing emotional involvement, though she didn't need to say whose. The rule was unspoken, but absolute, no personal attachment between doctor and patient. Yet each time he passed her room, his steps slowed, drawn to the quiet warmth that had once been nothing but stillness. On the 3rd day of her awakening, he couldn't resist. He entered quietly, finding her awake and sitting upright for the first time. Sunlight streamed across her blanket, and for a moment, he just stood there, watching her relearn how to exist. She turned her head toward him, slow but deliberate, and when their eyes met, something in the room shifted, the hum of the machines, the rhythm of his heart, everything. Her voice was fragile, but she managed a faint smile. You came back. He hesitated, searching for the right balance between truth and professionalism. I never really left, he said. She studied him for a long moment, her expression soft and sure. I remember something, she whispered. The lights, the voices, your voice, you said. She paused, eyes closing briefly. You'd be here if I woke up. His throat tightened. He wanted to answer, to tell her everything he'd meant in those hours between science and prayer. But the words were too dangerous. They carried too much truth. You went through something extraordinary, he said finally, carefully. Maybe your mind held on to fragments. She shook her head weakly. No, it wasn't fragments. I heard you. You used to tell me stories. About the snow. About music. You thought I was gone, but I wasn't. Her voice cracked, tears slipping free. Instinctively, he stepped forward, his hand hovering above hers before retreating. The rule stopped him, that invisible boundary between empathy and intimacy. But she saw it anyway. "You don't have to pretend," she murmured. "I felt it too. Every time you were here, I wasn't afraid." He sat, finally, breaking the rule without a word. "You have no idea what it means to hear that," he said, his voice barely audible. "There were nights I thought I was losing my mind. Talking to you, hoping for something, anything, to answer back." A soft smile formed on her lips. "Then maybe we saved each other." The words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Because in that moment, Noah realized how deeply his life had become intertwined with hers, and how impossible it would be to untangle them now that she was awake. The days became a rhythm of small recoveries, her first steps with the physical therapist, the first spoon of soup she held without trembling, the first time she laughed, a sound so soft he almost didn't believe it was real. The other doctors praised the progress, calling it remarkable neuroplasticity, but Noah knew it was something else, something inquantifiable, a connection that defied medicine. One afternoon, she asked him the question he'd been dreading. "What happens now?" He looked at her, struggling for an answer. "You heal," he said. "That's not what I meant." Her eyes locked onto his. "You stay, or you walk away." He hesitated. He wanted to tell her he couldn't stay, that it would cross every ethical line he had sworn to uphold. But when he looked into her eyes, the words dissolved. Instead, what came out was the truth he could no longer hide. "I don't know how to leave." She smiled faintly, her eyes wet with something between joy and pain. "Then don't." He should have stopped her. He should have walked out. But as she reached for his hand, slow, trembling, alive, he felt the weight of every night he had spent beside her bed. Every whisper, every story, every heartbeat. It was all still there, between their palms. For the first time, she was not a silence. She was real. And the doctor who had vowed to save her life realized she had saved his in return. The boundaries dissolved quietly, the way night fades into dawn, not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small ones no one could timestamp. Noah started spending his breaks in her room again, under the pretense of checking progress. At first, it was questions about her memory, her speech, her vision. Then it became conversations that drifted beyond recovery, about music, and fear, and the strange ways people learn to live again after losing everything. Elena's voice, though still soft, carried a gravity that drew him in. She spoke like someone who had lived a century inside her own mind. "When you're asleep for that long," she said one afternoon, her gaze fixed on the light spilling across the sheets, time stops belonging to clocks. "You start to live inside sounds, footsteps, breathing, the way someone says your name. That's how I know I wasn't alone. You gave me time when I had none." He wanted to tell her that she had given him something too, a reason to stay in a world he had quietly detached from. But the words stayed behind his teeth, restrained by the part of him still clinging to his oath. He had always believed medicine was about precision, about controlling outcomes with intellect and skill. But she had taught him something no textbook could, that sometimes saving someone means allowing yourself to feel again. The hospital soon became too small for what was growing between them. Their eyes lingered too long, his visits stretched beyond protocol. Harper noticed, of course, she always did. One evening, she pulled him aside. "You need to decide what kind of doctor you want to be," she said bluntly. "Because right now, you're walking into dangerous territory." He met her gaze, weary and unflinching. "I already crossed that line," he admitted, the night she opened her eyes. Harper studied him for a long time, then exhaled slowly. "Then make sure whatever you're doing, it's worth the cost." That night, he returned to Elena's room knowing exactly what that cost was: his reputation, his career, maybe even the life he had built on structure and restraint. But when he saw her smile, the faint color returning to her cheeks, none of it seemed to matter. She looked at him the way sunlight looks at glass, softly, wholly, without expectation. He sat beside her, silent for a while, then finally spoke. "They want me off your case completely." Her expression faltered, pain flickering across her features. "Because of me." "Because of us," he said honestly. She looked down, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the blanket. "Then tell me this," she whispered. "Was it real, or was I just a story you told yourself to survive the nights?" Her question pierced deeper than he expected. He leaned forward, voice low. trembling. Elena, every word I said to you while you slept, every story, every promise, was real. I didn't plan this, I didn't want it, but somehow, it happened. You became the only thing in this place that felt alive. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but recognition. You don't have to protect me, Noah, she said softly. You already did. The room fell into that familiar, sacred quiet, the same one that had once separated them. Only now, it didn't feel like distance, it felt like home. He reached out, fingers brushing hers, and for a moment, the world narrowed to that touch, the pulse beneath her skin, the life he had once fought to keep from slipping away. If I could do it all again, he whispered, I'd still choose to find you in the dark. Her voice was a breath. Then maybe you never lost me. Outside, the storm that had been gathering all evening broke against the hospital windows, thunder rolling through the corridors. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the room was illuminated by the glow of the machines, the same glow that had once held her life. But this time, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And he, the doctor who had fallen in love with a silence, finally understood that some resurrections don't happen on operating tables, they happen in hearts learning to beat again. Weeks later, room 407 no longer looked like a place for the dying. The blinds were open now, the flowers on her windowsill changed weekly by volunteers who didn't even know her name. The air smelled of antiseptic and sunlight, a strange mixture of endings and beginnings. Eleanor was walking again, her voice stronger, her laughter soft but certain. Life, once a fragile thread, now moved through her like music. Noah watched from a distance at first, keeping to the edges of corridors, blending into white coats and fluorescent light. The board had reassigned him to another wing. Officially, his connection to her case was over, but love doesn't sign discharge papers. It lingers in glances, in memories, in the ache of wanting what you can't ethically reach. Every day, he found excuses, checking vitals for data consistency, reviewing charts that weren't his to read, and every day, she caught him. Their eyes met through doorways, across the hum of hospital noise, and for a few seconds, time bent to their rhythm again. When her discharge date was finally set, she asked to see him. Harper hesitated but allowed it, maybe out of pity, maybe out of understanding. Noah walked into the room one last time, his heart caught between pride and loss. She sat by the window, sunlight resting on her hair, no machines between them anymore. Just breath, and memory, and a silence that had learned to speak. You're leaving tomorrow, he said, forcing a smile. I am, she replied. But it doesn't feel like leaving, not really. He nodded, but the truth pressed against his ribs. He had no right to ask her to stay, no right to follow her into a world where his love couldn't wear a white coat to disguise itself. You've come so far, he said quietly. You should be proud. She looked at him for a long time, the kind of look that makes promises words can't carry. Do you know what I remember most? She asked. He shook his head. The stories, she said. Your voice. You thought I was asleep, but I heard everything. You told me the world was still waiting for me. That there was light beyond the dark. You gave me that light, Noah. His throat tightened. And you gave me something to believe in again. Silence settled, not cold or clinical, but warm and whole. She reached out her hand, and this time, he didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging that what existed between them had never been a mistake, only something too human for the world they worked in. I don't know what happens next, she whispered. He smiled faintly. Maybe that's the point. You're alive now. You get to find out. Her eyes shimmered. And you. He exhaled softly, glancing toward the door where the world of rules and obligations waited. I'll keep doing what I was meant to do, he said, voice trembling, but I'll never forget what you taught me, that sometimes healing isn't about saving a life. It's about finding your own pulse again. She squeezed his hand once, gently, as if memorizing its shape. Then promise me one thing, she whispered. Don't stop talking to the ones who can't answer. Someone's always listening. He nodded, eyes wet. When she walked out of the hospital the next morning, fragile but free, he stood by the window, watching her cross the courtyard bathed in early light. The world moved around her, nurses laughing, orderlies pushing stretchers, the rhythm of ordinary life resuming. But to him, it was a miracle replaying in real time. Elena turned once, just before stepping through the gates, and met his eyes across the distance. She smiled, back quiet, knowing smile that belonged to both of them, and then she was gone. Noah stood there for a long time, listening to the heartbeat of the hospital, the echo of her voice still somewhere in the air. And when he finally returned to the operating room that afternoon, he felt something different. His hands were steady, his heart alive. The silence had given him back his purpose. And the woman who woke in the middle of surgery had taught him that even in the quietest corners of medicine, love can still find its way through.